I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the ongoing concern over anti-Semitism in America. Many in the Jewish community point a finger at Donald Trump, arguing that the tone of his election campaign and his antipathy to illegal immigrants has created a climate of hatred in our country that has fanned the flames all over, including anti-Semitism. But one prominent Jewish thinker and columnist has written a piece from a very different perspective, arguing that, ironically, Donald Trump has raised the awareness of anti-Semitism in America and that he's not receiving appropriate recognition for that from the Jewish community. The piece was written by Jonathan Tobin and appeared in the Israeli right-leaning newspaper Israeli Hayom, which is distributed free of charge in Israel and has the largest circulation of any Israeli daily. And I'm so pleased to be joined now by Jonathan Tobin, who's the opinion editor at the online Jewish news service jns.org. And Jonathan is also a contributing writer for National Review. Jonathan, it's so good to speak with you again here on JBS.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me on again.
So, Jonathan, why don't you explain to us what prompted you to write what could be called a positive piece about Donald Trump as he relates to anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it would probably be something of an exaggeration to say it's positive about Trump. What I'm trying to do is put some very real concerns in perspective. Now, of course, but I start with an ironic point, which is to say that Trump has, as I say, ironically raised awareness about anti-Semitism. Because as much as we're really going through a period in these last months where it's gotten tremendous amount of attention, a lot of what we're seing now is nothing new. Anti-Semitism didn't begin, and it won't end with Donald Trump.
Yes.
One of the points I've made, and I've tried to make this before in other contexts, is that FBI hate crime statistics, going back to when they first started to be tabulated, have always shown that crimes against Jews, anti-Semitic crimes, have vastly outnumbered those of any other faith community. And that includes Muslims, whom, we're supposed to think that there's been this huge anti-Muslim post-9/11 backlash, for which there really is no concrete proof. So it's interesting that, let's start first by saying it's interesting that all of a sudden people are really caring about it. Now, part of that is based in something real. The bomb threats against JCCs all over the country, which are now well over 100 in number. It's scary. I've gone around the country giving speeches in these last few months. I've been at many of these JCCs that have had to be evacuated. Thank God that none of them have been real threats, no real bombs, just an attempt to scare. So we've got this idea, though, in the minds of the Jewish community, that, or at least in many of those in the Jewish community, that these threats, anecdotal evidence about other hate against Jews, that the address for it is Donald Trump.
Yes.
And I think that there's really not a lot of basis for it. So I guess if you were to sum up my opinion, it would be that anti-Semitism is real, but the current furor over it, the sudden concern over it, is kind of what we call now fake news.
Yes.
Because anti-Semitism isn't new, and what we're experiencing here isn't, this panic, this wave of hate. And to listen to some of my friends on the left, they think they're living in Weimar Germany in the last days before Hitler took over, when nothing like that is actually happening.
Yes.
And I think it's important to point that out.
Yes. By the way, were you upset with the White House's conscious decision not to mention the Jewish victims of the Shoah when they issued a statement for International Holocaust Day?
You're darn right I was. That was, in sports we'd call it an unforced era,
yes.
but it was a very bad era. And a lot of the reason why Trump has been taking so much of a beating over anti-Semitism in recent months is that it's kind of his own fault. Now, it's his own fault for two reasons. Most immediately, it's because, sort of characteristically for Donald Trump, who is such a defensive-minded person who is always worried that people are attacking him, and of course they generally are, he interpreted any question, even a softball thrown at him, a layup, in order, just requesting him to say sort of the normal pro forma, yes, I'm against hate kind of questions. He viewed that as an attack. And in two press conferences in a row, he, instead of saying those few words that just needed to be said, instead he attacked the questioner for saying, how dare you say that I'm an anti-Semite? I'm not an anti-Semite. I have Jewish grandchildren. That wasn't what he needed to say in that instance, and that added to the problem. But of course, there's the other point. You alluded to it in your setup in terms of how he campaigned. Again, here, there's some basis for this. Trump did do a fair amount of dog whistling last year, puzzlingly so at times, about hate groups.
Yes.
He failed to condemn David Duke immediately when pretended he didn't know who he was. And there was a lot of coddling of the alt-right extremists who flocked to his cause. Now, the alt-right is real. Any journalist, especially conservative Jewish journalists, people like myself, who were critical of Donald Trump, know very well that the alt-right is real because, we were subjected to a lot of hate in our Twitter feeds and all that. But again, let's put it in perspective. The alt-right is a very small group of people. And even Breitbart.com, which is supposed to be their platform, doesn't really publish them. It's just occasionally, nodded in their direction. It is itself not an anti-Semitic publication as much as I've taken issue with it at times. So Trump has set up, and certainly with his very hostile statements about Mexicans and Muslims, which were really inappropriate and not the sort of thing we should hear from a president, whatever your stand on the issues might be. So people are predisposed to think that he's willing to coddle hate. But to say that anti-Semitism has been unleashed by him is, it's a bridge too far.
Yes.
The dots just don't connect. And they don't connect for a number of reasons. Number one, as Trump himself has pointed out, he has so many Jewish connections. His daughter converted to Judaism. He's got Jewish grandchildren. Yes. He openly celebrates them. He is a very strong friend of Israel. I mean, he's proven that. Certainly much different from his predecessor. There's a lot less hostility. So, again, we're not focusing on actual deeds. We're focusing on atmospherics. And what I think is going on here with a lot of the discussion about anti-Semitism, which I might add, Abe Foxman, the former head of the ADL, who is not exactly someone who is slow to cry anti-Semitism, right?
Yes.
Foxman is someone who has been accused, sometimes very unfairly, of being too quick to accuse people of anti-Semitism and stirring up panic about it. Foxman rightly said, this is a problem, it's not
Absolutely.
a crisis.
Absolutely.
Everyone with their eyes open and, not completely blinded by partisanship understands that in 2017, American Jews are accepted in every segment of our society. A third of the Supreme Court. I don't need to cite all the statistics. Everybody knows that we have problems with assimilation
yes.
because we're accepted everywhere. Everybody
yes.
else loves us.
Exactly.
We're not hated.
Exactly.
American exceptionalism is real. Anti-Semitism is rising around the world. It's not really rising in the United States. So we're kind of misrepresenting the problem, and I think it's due to the fact that many of our friends on the left can't separate their antipathy for the politics of Donald Trump or the person of Donald Trump from their fears about anti-Semitism. It's sort of the principle is everybody I don't like is Hitler. And that's where Trump, who has, as I've said, he's somewhat to blame for his problems. He could have dealt with this much more easily. He could have brushed this away before he finally started in the last few weeks saying the things that he needed to say and saying them repeatedly. But still, as I said, the sudden concern over this, and I might add, as I noted in another piece that I wrote this week, when the head of the United Nations Human Rights Council, a font of hatred against Jews, cites the bomb threats against JCCs and starts lecturing the United States about anti-Semitism, then you know the issue's been hijacked for reasons that have nothing to do with the security of the Jewish people.
I so appreciate the courage you had to write this piece. Incidentally, in your piece, you make it clear you believe that it is a function, the criticism related to anti-Semitism of Donald Trump. And you and I understand there are many reasons legitimate reasons a person can criticize Donald Trump. But the point you're making in your piece is that the attempt to use anti-Semitism as another example of how bad Donald Trump is, that is really coming from the far left and from liberal critics more than it is from centrists or on the right. Do I understand you correctly?
Yes, I think that's quite true, and I might add, I have myself been very critical of Donald Trump, especially during the election campaign. The point is here that when we look at what he has done and what he has said, there's plenty of grounds to criticize him. You know, we live in a democracy. We're entitled to criticize anyone, and if there has ever been someone who is vulnerable to criticism, it is the man who is, clearly not a normal president. He doesn't behave the way other presidents or other politicians do. I think some of our antipathy for him is class-based, but and more maybe even than ideology, because he's not really an ideologue, not really a conservative in many ways. But it's clear to me that a lot of the people who are crying, sounding the alarm about anti-Semitism, really weren't that interested in this as an issue until it could be blamed on Donald Trump.
Yes, exactly.
I've spent my career in Jewish journalism.
Yes.
We worry about, and there was a lot of attention given to the cemetery desecrations in Philadelphia and in St. Louis, and rightly so. But as anybody who's been covering the Jewish community the last 30 years the way I have knows, these weren't exactly the first time something like that has happened.
Right.
It's happened many times. It happened under Obama. It happened under other people. It wasn't Obama's fault that there were cemeteries that were desecrated when he was president.
I agree 100%.
He could be rightly accused, and I think it's important to point out that when the hyper-caché, at the time of the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris and the kosher market was attacked and Jews were killed, he didn't acknowledge that was anti-Semitism. He said it was just a random attack, as if Islamists, ISIS terrorists would just randomly choose out of all the supermarkets in Paris the kosher one.
Yes, and you're speaking now about Barack Obama and his response when the kosher... Right.
So that was clearly something where he was not recognizing anti-Semitism, in which he was almost rationalizing it.
Yes.
But our friends on the left didn't point to Barack Obama and say, you are enabling anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Even though he clearly had a blind spot about it in that context. I'm not saying he was anti-Semitic. I'm not saying he wanted to stir up anti-Semitism. I'm saying there were grounds to criticize him that were just as strong, if not far stronger, than those against Trump. But we have embraced, so much of our community has embraced this narrative that if there's anti-Semitism, it's because Trump unleashed it. Well, my response to that is, where have you been all these years?
Yes.
I take issue with the alt-right and the anti-Semites and white nationalists and people like David Duke. We're rightly angry about them, and we should be doing everything we can to combat their efforts, small though they are. But let's also understand that the primary source of anti-Semitism in the world right now is not coming from, people on the far right, the tiny far right in the United States. It's coming from the BDS movement. It's coming from Islamists who target Israel and the Jewish people, and their fellow travelers supporting BDS on American campuses, who, wherever they raise their banner, anti-Semitism follows. Let's keep our eye on the ball here. That's the main problem. And let's also point out one other key fact about the bomb threats against the JCCs, which, as I said, are real. People have a right to be upset about it, and anybody whose family has been involved in that, who sends their kids to a JCC, this is a real issue. It's not fake. But the one person so far that has been arrested for involvement with it was not an alt-right follower of Donald Trump. He was a leftist journalist who, whatever his bizarre motives, had nothing to do with Trump. So many people have gotten out ahead of this story. And the reason why they have done it is because of their political opinions, because they are so angry about Donald Trump. They're so angry about his policies. They're so angry about the atmosphere about him that they're willing to draw straight lines between dots that really don't connect.
Again, I think you say it beautifully. You mentioned the left and the liberal bias against Donald Trump, which we understand. What do you think about the media? Has the liberal mainstream media been fair in your mind or unfair to Donald Trump?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, because Trump is such an easy target, and Trump more or less invites criticism. Even if you are not looking to criticize him, he does things that are outrageous. He says things that are not true. He sometimes, it's like he's got an allergy for the truth. And he is the sort of person who thinks he can say anything about anyone who is a critic, and then act as if it never happened. Just wish it away. Where right now the press is still chasing its tail as we're speaking over his clearly unsubstantiated accusation that Barack Obama, wiretapped him in Trump Tower. And it goes back to, it's a cliche already. We've heard it so many times that, people, Trump supporters took him, did not take him literally, but they took him seriously. But the press and his critics don't take him seriously, but they take him literally.
Exactly.
It's impossible to view anything. We have to assume that anything that comes out of his mouth is either meant for momentary political advantage or is for entertainment value. So you can't entirely criticize the press for not knowing how to cover someone whom is not always, it's not as if he's got an agenda, and sometimes he shades the truth, as is true of most politicians, is that you can never really trust anything he says. However, let's also understand something. Our mainstream press is overwhelmingly liberal.
Yes.
That's always been true. It was, it didn't mean that conservatives couldn't prevail. Just ask Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
But it is an additional hurdle.
Yes.
And, that bias comes out in many ways. The thing about Donald Trump is that he encourages journalists to drop the pretense of objectivity. I wrote a story last week concerning, the unrest at the New York Daily News, which during the election campaign was over the top anti-Trump, just crazy, front page cartoons of him beheading the Statue of Liberty. And then they changed the editors, and now they're just critical of him. They just criticize him. And the staff of the Daily News is terribly upset. They consider this treason to the cause of journalism because they're not trying to kill their editor isn't trying to tilt the scales against Trump in every way in an over-the-top manner. That kind of tips you off that what's going on here is very serious. And when people do things like that, and we see it not just in the New York Daily News, but in the Bible of liberalism, the flagship of their journalistic fleet, the New York Times, then you see these things like that, and then you say, well, Steve Bannon, former CEO of Breitbart, who is a senior advisor to Trump, when he says that the press, or at least much of the liberal media, is the opposition party even more than the Democrats, it's hard to argue with him.
Absolutely right.
Much of the press is acting like it's the opposition party.
Absolutely right. Yep. By the way, you and I are not necessarily from the same political orientation or philosophical orientation, but I want you to know that it really upsets me, Jonathan, when my side does something which we criticized when it was done to us. And the old adage, whose ox is being gored? It seems to me at the moment, the mainstream media, which, as you say, definitely skews liberal. And that's okay if it did not run into what is now called journalism. And you've been a journalist, I don't know how many years now your career spans, but you understand what journalism means, and you often are an opinion person. But journalism is not supposed to be biased. It's not supposed to root. It's not supposed to be partisan. It's supposed to simply give the reader or the viewer or the listener information. And at the moment, we're seeing in the mainstream media a lot of partisanship that one can understand would create inside the administration, no matter whose administration it is, a certain kind of anxiety, if not disdain. That's what worries me, Jonathan, about the way in which the mainstream media that tends to be liberal has treated everything Donald Trump does. No matter, they don't like the way he breathes. That's not appropriate. And things are said and portrayed on television, which had it been done to Barack Obama, the outcry would have been deafening. That's what bothers me. What's your scene?
Well, I think you're right, and I think I would make a broader point about this. This is toxic for democracy. Now, a lot of people in the press were up in arms, and not unreasonably so, when Donald Trump said that the press is the enemy of the people. We don't like language like that. That's Robespierrean. That's not. Democracy is not about making our opponents enemies of the people, because we know what happens to enemies of the people. They get knocked off. That's not good. That's not democratic language. Democratic with a small d. But the problem is the open partisanship of the press, the belief on the part of many of my colleagues in the media that their mission isn't to sort of just frame the story, let the viewers, the readers make up their own minds, but to act as advocates, to break down the church-state divide that's supposed to exist between news and opinion, and to make everything basically an advocacy piece trying to prove that Donald Trump is not merely wrong, but that he's illegitimate. One of the phrases that Democrats and liberals have used in recent months is resistance. That they are not merely opposing Trump, they are resisting him as if he were an alien or a foreign occupier of the government, rather than the person who, whether you like it or not, won the presidential election by the rules set up by our founders. And that has bred within the Trump administration, which was, figures around him, people like Bannon, they're paranoid enough. They have their own agendas. They're not, they're not very friendly. Their agenda was to sort of, overthrow the establishment and to sort of knock over the apple cart. It's freed them up. It's made them feel that they can do anything. And this isn't the way our democracy is supposed to work. This isn't the way it works best. And I would say parenthetically, I don't think it's really in the interest of those who wish to legitimately oppose Donald Trump, who hope for his defeat when if he runs for re-election in 2020. This isn't the way to do it, because it just convinces the people who are already supporting him that they were right. Yes. And that Trump is right when he labels them enemies, when Bannon is right when he labels them the opposition.
Exactly.
It creates a further divisive atmosphere. We are kind of a bifurcated nation in that, people just read only the things that, confirm their prejudices and opinions, and that was always true in recent years. The quintessential divide was between people who just, watch Fox News and listen to talk radio and those who listen to NPR or read the New York Times and never the twain shall meet. That's gotten worse in recent years because of social media. And more Americans get their news from Facebook, not from reading a publication or watching the TV. And on Facebook and social media, you can create a news feed and just completely eliminate anything, insulate yourself from opposing views. That's why the 48% that voted for Hillary Clinton thinks that the 46% that voted for Trump are trying to destroy their liberties, and the 46% that voted for Trump thinks the 48% that voted for Clinton is out to get them.
Exactly.
And when the press acts in an openly partisan way, and when we have an administration that sees it and doubles down on that atmosphere, the division grows worse, and I think that's bad for us as a country and as a people.
I could not agree with you more. We only have a minute, Jonathan. Have you seen anything, any evidence at all, that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia during the 2016 elections?
Don't ask me. If you read the New York Times article, which was leaked from sources within the intelligence community about it, they made it very clear that there was no collusion. There's no proof of collusion.
Exactly.
The Russian connection is, the Benghazi of liberals right now. It's the great white whale that they're chasing because it feeds into their belief that Trump didn't win fairly, that the election was stolen, that he's a foreign, he's a mole. This is like listening to people on the far right talking about Obama being, an Islamist mole in the White House rather than just a guy that they disagree with.
Right.
Believe me, every president, since starting with Clinton, has fostered a derangement syndrome among his opponents, and it's gotten worse with each successive one. The one for Bush was worse than the one for Clinton. The one for Obama was worse than the one for Bush. The one for Trump has, just gone off the rails completely, and it's just a mistake for my if they want to take any advice from me, from my liberal and Democratic friends. There's plenty about Trump that you can legitimately oppose. There's enough about him that you think is wrong that you can take issue with. If you're going to go down the rabbit hole of conspiracies about Russia and about stealing the election and about Trump being a Russian agent, you are following in the footsteps of the birthers, and you're doing your cause no good, and you're doing our country no good either. Let's stay away from these conspiracy theories. Let's stick to the real issues about which we have legitimate debates. And if we do that, let the chips fall where they may. But the delegitimization of an admittedly abnormal president, he's not a normal president. Let's concede that right up. If you're trying to delegitimize him, you're undermining your own cause.
You could not have said it better. It is wonderful to talk to you, Jonathan. You're doing great work. You've done great work for so many years. Now you're doing great work with JNS and with the National Review. I wish you kol tuv hatzlacha, and I hope you'll let me call you all the time. Keep writing, and we'll keep talking.
Great. Thanks very much for having me.
You be well. The thoughts of Jonathan Tobin, opinion editor at the online Jewish news service, jns.org. He's also a contributing writer to National Review. He's going to be writing for Haaretz. A very interesting guy and a very thoughtful guy, and he makes us think. And it's what we've been saying all the time. You can be against Donald Trump for very good reasons. Leave the nonsense out of it. And at the moment, you watch the mainstream liberal media, it is replete with nonsense. My thanks, as always, to our director and production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, filling in for Sloan Copeland, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.